In the glittering courts of ancient kingdoms, the image of royal concubines often evokes visions of luxury and privilege. Yet, behind this dazzling facade lay a complex and precarious existence, rarely captured fully in historical narratives. Royal concubines were women who, while not officially queens or wives, occupied significant and sometimes influential positions within the intricate hierarchies of royal courts across diverse cultures. Their roles were far more than mere adornments to the throne. They played crucial parts in the continuity of dynasties and, in some cases, the subtle machinations of court politics. It was completely normal in many societies for kings and emperors to maintain a harem or a retinue of concubines, each vying for attention, favor, and the chance to bear a royal heir. Unlike queens, who enjoyed formal status, legal protections, and public recognition, concubines occupied an ambiguous social position. They were officially recognized as consorts but lacked the full rights and privileges of marriage. This ambiguity created a fragile existence, close to power, yet often vulnerable and exposed to the whims of their royal patrons and the shifting tides of court alliances. Back then, the primary role of royal concubines was to bear children, especially sons, who could secure the succession of the ruling family. Bearing a male heir was the surest path to gaining favor, influence, and a degree of security within the palace. However, this biological function was intertwined with the political and social dynamics of the court. A concubine's ability to produce offspring could elevate her status, but failure to do so often meant neglect, dismissal, or worse. The pressure to conceive was immense, and the stakes were life-altering. Surprisingly, despite their lack of formal status, some concubines wielded considerable influence behind the scenes. Their proximity to the monarch allowed them access to private moments and confidential discussions, where decisions could be swayed and favors granted. In some cases, concubines became key players in palace intrigue, acting as intermediaries between the ruler and powerful court factions. This influence, however, was never guaranteed and depended heavily on the ruler's favor, the presence of heirs, and the shifting alliances within the court. It was completely normal for royal concubines to live lives marked by a paradox, immense proximity to power yet deep personal insecurity. They were often excluded from succession rights, meaning that even their children might not be guaranteed a path to the throne if there were legitimate queens and heirs. This exclusion reinforced their marginalization, creating a delicate balance between privilege and vulnerability. The social stigma attached to concubinage varied across cultures, but in many cases, concubines were seen as secondary figures, important but ultimately dispensable. The legal protections, or lack thereof, further complicated their position. While queens and legitimate wives were often shielded by laws and customs, concubines had limited recourse against mistreatment or abandonment. Their status was contingent upon the ruler's favor and the political climate of the court. Without formal recognition, concubines could be dismissed, confined, or even punished with little warning. This precariousness underscored the fragility of their existence and the intense competition that often defined their daily lives. Royal concubines were also subject to rigid court hierarchies that dictated their rank, privileges, and duties. These hierarchies could be elaborate, with titles and ranks assigned based on factors such as the number of children born, the favor of the ruler, and political alliances. Navigating this system required skill, patience, and sometimes ruthlessness. The struggle for advancement within the harem was not just about personal ambition but survival. Falling out of favor could mean loss of status, security, and even freedom. Back then, the role of concubines extended beyond mere companionship or reproduction. They were part of a broader system that reinforced royal authority and legitimacy. By surrounding themselves with numerous consorts, rulers demonstrated their power and virility, a symbol of divine or political right to rule. Concubinage was thus embedded in the cultural and political fabric of the time, reflecting societal norms about gender, power, and hierarchy. Yet, the lives of these women were often shrouded in silence, their stories overshadowed by those of kings, queens, and male courtiers. Historical records tend to overlook concubines or portray them through biased lenses, either romanticizing their beauty and influence or casting them as scheming and manipulative figures. This selective memory has contributed to a distorted understanding of their true experiences, which were frequently marked by hardship, insecurity, and resilience. Despite these challenges, some concubines managed to carve out remarkable legacies. Their children might ascend to the throne, or they might themselves become power brokers within the court. The distinction between queen and concubine could blur, especially in times of political upheaval or when a concubine's son succeeded as heir. In such moments, the precarious status of concubinage could transform dramatically, revealing the fluidity and complexity of royal court life. It was completely normal for royal concubines to be caught in this web of cultural expectations, political ambitions, and personal desires. Their existence was a delicate balancing act between proximity to power and the ever-present threat of dispossession. While they lacked the formal honors and protections of queens, their influence and roles were integral to the functioning and continuation of royal dynasties. Understanding the position of royal concubines offers a window into the gendered power dynamics and social hierarchies that shaped imperial courts across history. Surprisingly, this ambiguous status also meant that concubines were often invisible in official histories, their voices muted and their sufferings unrecorded. Their lives remind us that behind the grandeur of monarchy lay personal dramas of ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and survival. In the shadowy corridors of power, concubines navigated a world where beauty and favor could be as much a curse as a blessing. In sum, royal concubinage was a multifaceted institution, reflecting a complex interplay of gender, power, and culture. These women were far from mere decorative figures, they were vital actors within royal courts, shaping dynasties through childbirth, influence, and sometimes intrigue. Yet, their precarious status and lack of formal recognition left them vulnerable to exploitation and neglect, casting a long shadow over their historical legacy. As we delve deeper into their stories, we begin to uncover the hidden realities behind the glittering image of royal concubines and the courts they inhabited. Having explored the ambiguous status and roles of royal concubines within the grand tapestry of imperial courts, it's essential to understand the daily realities that shaped their lives behind palace walls. It was completely normal for these women to live in seclusion, confined within the labyrinthine quarters of harems or secluded palace wings, far removed from the bustling world outside. These secluded spaces were not merely residences but carefully controlled environments designed to maintain order, hierarchy, and the monarch's privacy. Back then, the harem was a world unto itself, an enclosed sphere where social interactions were heavily regulated, and every movement was scrutinized. Concubines rarely ventured beyond these confines, their lives circumscribed by strict protocols that governed their behavior, appearance, and even their speech. This isolation served multiple purposes, preserving the ruler's honor, preventing illicit liaisons, and maintaining the exclusivity of royal bloodlines. However, it also meant that concubines faced profound loneliness and disconnection from the outside world. Surprisingly, the control over their daily lives extended far beyond physical confinement. Concubines' communications were closely monitored, with eunuchs, guards, and palace officials acting as intermediaries or gatekeepers. Letters and messages could be censored or intercepted, limiting the ability of these women to maintain relationships with family members or allies outside the palace. This surveillance heightened their dependence on the favor of the ruler and the court's power brokers, deepening their vulnerability. Pressure to conform to rigorous beauty standards was another defining feature of a concubine's existence. In the imperial courts, physical appearance was not merely a matter of vanity but a crucial factor determining a woman's value and influence. Concubines were expected to embody idealized notions of beauty, flawless skin, graceful demeanor, and impeccable grooming. Failure to meet these standards could result in diminished favor, social exclusion, or worse. This relentless emphasis on appearance often exacted a heavy toll, with concubines subjected to strict diets, cosmetic rituals, and sometimes painful treatments designed to enhance their allure. It was completely normal for these women to live under constant surveillance, where their every gesture and interaction were observed by palace officials and rival consorts alike. This scrutiny fostered an atmosphere of tension and competition, as concubines vied for the ruler's attention and favor. Rivalries and jealousy were not merely personal quarrels but survival strategies in a zero-sum game where a single misstep could lead to disgrace or expulsion. Back then, psychological stress was an ever-present companion. The stakes were high, and the environment was charged with suspicion and rivalry. Concubines had to navigate complex social dynamics, balancing alliances and enmities with delicate precision. The fear of being supplanted or cast aside created an undercurrent of anxiety that could erupt into outright hostility. Violent confrontations, though not always openly recorded, were not uncommon, and palace intrigue often took ruthless forms. The pressure to produce heirs added another layer of complexity to these relationships. Bearing a child, especially a son, was the surest path to securing a concubine's position and influence within the court. Yet this biological imperative came with immense physical and emotional costs. Many concubines endured repeated pregnancies and childbirths under conditions that were far from ideal. Medical care was rudimentary, and complications could lead to lasting health problems or even death. Surprisingly, the constant demand for fertility and the high stakes attached to childbearing intensified the competition among concubines. Those who bore multiple children, especially sons, often gained privileges and protections, while those who failed to conceive faced marginalization. This dynamic created a fraught atmosphere where reproductive success dictated not only status but survival. It was completely normal for concubines to be caught in this relentless cycle of expectation and anxiety. Their value was often measured by their ability to produce heirs, yet the process itself was physically taxing and emotionally fraught. The palace, far from being a sanctuary, could become a site of profound suffering and vulnerability. Moreover, the strict routines imposed on concubines extended to their daily activities and interactions. Their schedules were regimented, with time allocated for grooming, entertainment, religious rituals, and audiences with the ruler. Leisure and personal expression were constrained by the ever-present need to maintain decorum and favor. Even friendships and alliances were carefully managed, as any perceived transgression could be exploited by rivals. Back then, these constraints underscored the tension between individual desires and institutional demands. Concubines had to suppress personal ambitions, navigate court etiquette, and constantly perform an idealized role crafted by tradition and political necessity. Their lives were a delicate dance of submission and subtle assertion, where survival depended on mastering the intricate rules of the harem. Surprisingly, despite the apparent luxury of palace life, the emotional toll on concubines was immense. Isolation from family and former social networks, combined with the pressures of surveillance and competition, fostered feelings of loneliness and despair. The controlled environment limited opportunities for genuine connection and support, intensifying psychological strain. It was completely normal for concubines to experience a profound sense of uncertainty about their futures. Their status was contingent on factors beyond their control, the ruler's favor, the birth of heirs, and the shifting alliances within the court. This precariousness bred anxiety and sometimes despair, as the threat of dismissal or exile loomed large. The relationships among concubines themselves were complex and often fraught. Rivalries could be fierce, fueled by jealousy, ambition, and the zero-sum nature of court favor. However, alliances and friendships also formed, offering moments of solidarity and mutual support in an otherwise isolating world. These social dynamics added yet another layer to the intricate web of palace life. Back then, the harem was not just a physical space but a battleground of emotions, power, and survival. The daily life of a concubine was shaped by a constant negotiation between personal agency and imposed limitations. Their experiences reveal the human cost behind the splendor and spectacle of royal courts. In sum, the daily existence of royal concubines was marked by seclusion, strict control, and intense competition. Their movements and communications were carefully monitored, their appearance meticulously maintained, and their reproductive potential relentlessly demanded. The psychological pressure of living under constant surveillance and navigating rivalries created a fragile and often painful reality. Understanding these aspects sheds light on the hidden struggles that defined the lives of these women, far removed from the glamorous image often portrayed in popular imagination. Behind the gilded walls of imperial palaces, beneath the veneer of elegance and ceremony, royal concubines often endured hardships that were both brutal and deeply hidden. It was completely normal, yet profoundly tragic, that many of these women suffered physical abuse as a grim reality of their existence. Punishments such as beatings and neglect were not uncommon and were wielded as tools of control and intimidation. When a concubine was perceived to have disobeyed orders, failed to produce an heir, or simply fallen out of favor, physical violence could be administered with little hesitation or consequence. Back then, the absence of legal protections for concubines left them vulnerable to such mistreatment. Unlike queens or official wives, who were often shielded by custom or law, concubines had scant recourse when subjected to punishment. Their fates were at the mercy of the ruler's will and the caprices of court officials, who enforced discipline with ruthless efficiency. This power imbalance created an environment where abuse could flourish unchecked, masked by the secrecy of palace life. Surprisingly, emotional abuse was just as pervasive as physical violence. Concubines were frequently subjected to psychological manipulation, including threats of exile, imprisonment, or even death. Such threats were not empty. Palace intrigue was rife with deadly consequences, and falling from favor could mean a swift and merciless downfall. The constant fear of punishment or abandonment weighed heavily on these women, fostering an atmosphere of dread and uncertainty. It was completely normal for rulers and court officials to use these tactics as means to maintain control. The palace was a microcosm of power struggles, and concubines were often caught in the crossfire. Emotional coercion served to keep them compliant and isolated, ensuring they remained dependent and subordinate. This psychological oppression compounded the physical dangers they faced, creating a harrowing existence marked by vulnerability and fear. Isolation was another cruel aspect of concubine life. Confined within the harem or designated quarters, these women were cut off from their families and the outside world. This separation not only deprived them of emotional support but also intensified their sense of helplessness. The uncertainty about their future, whether they would remain favored, be cast aside, or worse, added to their psychological torment. Back then, the combination of isolation, surveillance, and abuse created a toxic environment that severely affected the mental health of concubines. Feelings of despair, anxiety, and hopelessness were common, yet rarely acknowledged in historical accounts. The psychological trauma endured by these women is an often overlooked facet of palace life, overshadowed by the grandeur and political narratives that dominate official histories. The lack of legal protection was particularly devastating. Concubines had little to no right to defend themselves or seek justice. Complaints were seldom heard, and the very structure of the court discouraged any form of dissent. This systemic imbalance ensured that abuse remained hidden and unpunished, perpetuating a cycle of suffering. Surprisingly, even those concubines who managed to gain favor and bear children were not immune to mistreatment. Favor was fickle, and a single misstep or change in the ruler's affections could result in harsh punishment or exile. The precariousness of their position meant that no level of influence guaranteed safety from abuse. This reality underscored the brutal nature of power within the palace, where survival was a constant struggle. It was completely normal for concubines to live with the constant threat of violence and emotional torment, a truth that contrasts sharply with the romanticized images often found in literature and art. The reality was far darker, shaped by fear, control, and the ruthless demands of palace hierarchy. The psychological impact of such abuse extended beyond the individual. Rivalries and jealousy within the harem could exacerbate tensions, as concubines sometimes used accusations or manipulations to undermine their competitors, further entrenching a culture of suspicion and hostility. This environment fostered not only physical and emotional abuse from authorities but also interpersonal conflicts that deepened the trauma. Back then, the palace was a crucible of human suffering as much as it was a center of power and culture. The stories of concubines, though often silenced or distorted, reveal the harsh realities behind the opulence. Their endurance in the face of such adversity speaks to a resilience that is seldom recognized in historical accounts. In sum, the lives of royal concubines were marked by a disturbing blend of physical and psychological abuse. The tools of control, beatings, neglect, emotional manipulation, and threats, were wielded without restraint in an environment that offered little protection or hope. Understanding this grim aspect of concubine life challenges us to reconsider the narratives of palace grandeur and acknowledge the hidden suffering that sustained imperial power. Within the intricate web of palace life, royal concubines were often more than mere companions to the ruler, they were pawns and players in a high-stakes game of political intrigue and power. It was completely normal for concubines to be exploited as tools in these palace machinations, manipulated by factions seeking to advance their own agendas. Behind the scenes, their relationships with the monarch could be leveraged by courtiers, eunuchs, and ministers eager to influence succession, policy, or court dynamics. Back then, concubine status was inherently precarious, making them vulnerable to exploitation. Some were thrust into the spotlight not merely because of personal affection but because their presence served a political purpose. By placing favored concubines in key positions, rival factions sought to sway the ruler's decisions or secure influence over potential heirs. This manipulation turned the intimate sphere of the harem into a battlefield for power struggles that could determine the fate of entire kingdoms. Surprisingly, some concubines navigated this dangerous terrain with remarkable skill, using their proximity to the ruler to gain real political influence. By bearing heirs, especially sons, they could elevate their standing and secure protection against rivals. The mother of a future emperor wielded significant authority, sometimes acting as regent or advisor. Yet this influence was always contingent and fragile. A shift in the ruler's favor or a change in court alliances could quickly turn power into peril. It was completely normal for these women to find themselves caught in conspiracies and factional rivalries. Their relationships with rulers were closely watched and often exploited by competing courtiers, who sought to either bolster or undermine their positions. Accusations of intrigue, plotting, or poisoning were not uncommon, and could lead to imprisonments, exile, or execution. The palace was a place where trust was scarce, and alliances could shift overnight. Back then, succession crises heightened the dangers for concubines. When a ruler died or his favor waned, concubines and their offspring became targets in the fierce contests for power. The legitimacy of heirs born to concubines was sometimes questioned or challenged, and mothers were vulnerable to accusations designed to eliminate rivals. These struggles could erupt into open violence, reshaping the political landscape and determining the survival of dynasties. The precarious nature of a concubine's status meant that political survival required constant vigilance and adaptability. Favor could be fleeting, and falling out of grace meant not only loss of influence but also exposure to danger. Some concubines faced imprisonment or death when their faction lost power, underscoring the lethal stakes involved in palace intrigue. Surprisingly, the influence of concubines extended beyond the personal realm into broader political affairs. In some courts, they acted as intermediaries between the ruler and officials, conveyed messages, or influenced appointments and policies. Their ability to access the ruler's private moments gave them opportunities to shape decisions, even if their power was exercised discreetly. It was completely normal for concubines to wield this kind of soft power, yet their authority was rarely acknowledged in official histories. The patriarchal structure of many societies meant that the political significance of these women was often downplayed or obscured. Nevertheless, their behind-the-scenes roles were integral to the functioning and stability of the court. Back then, the volatile environment of the harem reflected the broader uncertainties of imperial politics. The lives of concubines were intertwined with shifting alliances, betrayals, and power plays that extended far beyond the palace walls. Their personal fortunes were bound to the complex and often dangerous currents of court life. The exploitation of concubines in political maneuvers also highlights the gendered nature of power in imperial courts. While men occupied formal positions of authority, women in the harem exercised influence through personal relationships and maternal connections. This informal power was a double-edged sword, granting opportunities for agency but also exposing them to profound risks. Surprisingly, some concubines managed to survive and even thrive in this treacherous environment, becoming key figures in the narrative of their times. Their stories illuminate the complex dynamics of power, gender, and survival in royal courts, challenging simplistic notions of passive victimhood. It was completely normal for these women to embody both vulnerability and resilience, navigating a path fraught with danger and opportunity. Their lives serve as a testament to the intricate interplay of affection, ambition, and politics that defined the inner world of monarchy. Understanding the political exploitation of concubines reveals the multifaceted nature of their roles, not merely as objects of desire but as active participants in the drama of empire. Their experiences underscore how personal relationships could shape history, influencing the course of dynasties and the fate of nations. Throughout history, the stories of royal concubines have often been overshadowed by those of kings, queens, and male courtiers, their suffering and resilience largely silenced or ignored. It was completely normal for historical records to minimize or overlook the hardships endured by these women, focusing instead on the grand narratives of rulers and dynasties. The voices of concubines, whose lives were entwined with power yet marked by vulnerability, have frequently been lost in the margins of history. Back then, the accounts that do exist are often filtered through biased perspectives, shaped by prevailing cultural attitudes and political interests. Concubines were sometimes romanticized as figures of beauty and intrigue or demonized as schemers and manipulators. Such portrayals obscure the complex realities of their experiences, reducing them to caricatures rather than acknowledging their humanity and the multifaceted roles they played within imperial courts. Surprisingly, recent scholarship has begun to unearth these hidden stories, aiming to shed light on the untold horrors and sacrifices that defined the lives of royal concubines. By examining palace records, personal correspondence, and other overlooked sources, historians are reconstructing a more nuanced picture, a narrative that acknowledges both the suffering and the resilience of these women. This re-evaluation challenges long-held assumptions and invites a deeper understanding of the social and political dynamics of monarchy. It was completely normal for royal concubines to endure a human cost that extended beyond physical and emotional suffering. Their stories reveal the darker side of court life, the price paid for proximity to power in a world governed by rigid hierarchies and brutal competition. The resilience displayed by many concubines, despite these hardships, speaks to their strength and agency within constrained circumstances. Back then, acknowledging the plight of concubines also serves as a reminder of the broader implications of power abuse. The mechanisms of control, exploitation, and silencing that shaped their lives were not unique to palace walls but reflected larger patterns of gendered oppression and political manipulation. Recognizing these patterns helps us understand the enduring legacies of inequality and the importance of giving voice to those historically marginalized. Surprisingly, the legacy of royal concubines continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about gender, power, and historical memory. Their experiences invite us to question whose stories are told and whose are forgotten, highlighting the importance of inclusivity and critical examination in the study of history. By bringing these hidden narratives to light, we gain a more comprehensive understanding of the past and its complexities. It was completely normal for the suffering and contributions of royal concubines to be overlooked, yet their stories are integral to the fabric of imperial history. They remind us that behind the grandeur of monarchy lay personal struggles and sacrifices that shaped the course of events in profound ways. Listening to their stories enriches our appreciation of history's human dimension. In sum, the historical silencing of royal concubines' sufferings calls for a cautious and empathetic approach to interpreting the past. Their lives, marked by hardship and endurance, offer critical insights into the intersections of gender, power, and society. Uncovering their stories is not just an act of historical recovery but a step toward a more just and inclusive understanding of human experience across time.